Okay, so this is going to be a recording of the Cells and Organelles lecture for Exeter Adult Education. I suggest that you pause and write down the notes and then unpause to hear my commentary about it. So we're talking about cells and organelles. This is a really important part of biology because cells are the basic unit of life. We'll get to that in a second. And organelles are what make them have their characteristics that they have that make them specialized cells. All right, so there are three parts of the cell theory. The first is the cell is the basic unit of life. The second is that all living organisms are made up of one or more cells, and we'll talk about the different types of cells in a minute, but some cells are an organism in and of themselves, and some cells are joined together with other cells to make one organism, and all cells come from other cells. So we talked about this in the first lecture, but it is an important part nonetheless. So there are two basic flavors of cells. The first flavor is the simple bacterial kind that is called prokaryotic. They do not have a nucleus or other fancy organelles that we talk about now, and when they do have an organelle, then I will stop and say, like, I'll note back to the prokaryotic cells. But mostly they do not have organelles. The second type is much more complex. It's called a eukaryotic cell. It has all of the organelles, or most of the organelles that we're going to talk about in this lecture. These make up the kingdoms of plants, animals, and the fungus kingdom. There's also a fourth kingdom called protists. You can kind of see protists in the picture, the black picture that is in the upper left-hand picture corner. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor while I do this. And the protists are single-celled organisms that live mostly in water or in wet conditions, and they don't fit into the other categories, but they are eukaryotes, so it's kind of a catch-all kingdom. It's actually really fun if you get a chance to study them. They're really neat. All right, so organelles. Organelles are specialized cell parts. They're the equivalent of organs to multicellular organisms, in that they all have little individual functions. On a quiz or a test, I would expect that you could name the organelles and identify what they look like. So those are my expectations, and you'll get practice on the quiz for that. All right, another important concept that we're going to talk about is homeostasis. Homeostasis is maintaining a separate environment inside your body or inside the cell versus the outside of the cell. So the outside, a good example of this is body temperature, or humans maintain a body temperature that is separate from their inside. So your insides will stay at hopefully around 98 degrees, where it can be quite hot or quite cold on the outside, and that is an example of homeostasis. But there are bunches of other ones. Single-celled organisms have characteristics where they have to maintain water balance, and that'll be really important when we talk next week about osmosis, so they don't explode from having too much water inside of them. So there are lots of different ways of maintaining homeostasis, and it is essential to maintain homeostasis in order to maintain life. It's critical. So this is just what I was just saying, that all living organisms have to maintain homeostasis in one way or another. All right, organelles. So we're going to label these on our plants and our animal cells. So you have a handout of a plant cell and an animal cell, and then we'll go over them at the end. Actually, in this lecture, we're going to go over them at the end. You also got a grid handout that has the functions, so you probably don't actually even have to write them down. All right, so the cell membrane here in this picture, the cell membrane is number, sorry, it's quite small on my screen, number 7. It's inside the cell wall, which we'll talk about next. All cells have a cell membrane that regulates what goes in and out, and this includes bacterial cells. We will talk a lot more about this in the next lecture. The cell wall here is number, I feel like it's 5. Yep, it's number 5. It's on the outside of a plant cell. It's made out of cellulose. We talked about this last week. Cellulose is that non-digestible plant material that we call fiber when it's in our diet. And in plants, it protects the plants. The plants have a water vacuole on the inside, a central vacuole that's number 4 here, and that fills up with water, and it's in case it gets dry for a while. It allows the plant to fill up with as much water as it can without exploding. Cytoplasm. Cytoplasm here is number 2. It is there and it cushions the organelles. It also is the place where a lot of the cellular reactions that happen that create the metabolism of the cell, they all occur in the cytoplasm. So it's an area of a rich biochemical activity. And as a point of order, cytoplasm is in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Ribosomes. Number 11 in this picture is ribosomes. They're stuck to the endoplasmic reticulum, which we will talk about later. Ribosomes are also one of the organelles that you will find in prokaryotes, so they're in bacteria as well. They are not membrane-bound organelles. They do not have membranes. And they create proteins. We'll talk about their relationship with the endoplasmic reticulum in a second. All right. Oftentimes under a microscope, which is what the lab is that we're going to do this week, you can only see the nucleus. The nucleus is like the most visible part of a cell. It stains very dark because the DNA inside of it stains very dark. So in this picture, number 8 is the nucleus. You could also call that the nuclear membrane, and you would be completely correct. And number 9 is the DNA, or the chromatin. It's sometimes called chromatin.
Do you know this essentially lesions? Okay, use a different leash.
Alright, the nucleolus is actually not labeled here, but it is the dark spot inside the nucleus, and it makes ribosomes that make proteins. And we will have a whole lecture later on in the course where we talk about making proteins, how DNA makes proteins. And we will talk a lot more about ribosomes then. Alright, I love this picture. It's not part of your picture set, but this diagram makes a good clarity between our sort of endomembrane systems. There are 3 parts to it. You have 2 different types of endoplasmic reticulum. One part has ribosomes all on the outside, and that's called rough-ER. It's called rough-ER because it has the ribosomes on them. With a microscope, it looks bumpy, so it looks rough. There is a smooth ER, which does not have ribosomes on it, and so it looks smooth when looked at under a microscope. And then there's a third endomembrane organelle called the Golgi apparatus, and the Golgi apparatus is separate and also has individual, they look kind of like stacks of pancakes. They have these individual units, and the video that you'll watch on the magic of cells will have good information on that. It has a nice depiction of it. Alright, so the rough ER has the ribosomes on its surface, so that's number 10. And it modifies proteins, so when you think of rough ER, I want you to think of proteins. It doesn't make the proteins, the ribosomes on the surface make the proteins, but it folds them up and makes them functional. Smooth ER. There isn't smooth ER in this picture. We will look at it on the animal cell and sort of find those then. It looks just like the rough ER, but it does not have the ribosomes on the outside. When I want you to think about smooth ER, I want you to think about lipids. That's the best. So it helps make lipids inside the cell. All right, now we're talking about the Golgi apparatus. The Golgi apparatus is not, I do not love it in this picture. When you think about the Golgi apparatus, I want you to think about it more like this picture that we talked about before. Not like this. This is not ideal, but number 6 is the Golgi apparatus in this. And it packages proteins and lipids inside vesicles, so little membrane-bound pouches, and ships it around the cells. So it is about moving and packaging organelles, cell products. And because of that, it is sometimes called the UPS of cells, because it does packing and shipping. All right, so there are chloroplasts. Chloroplasts in this are number 3. We will talk a lot about chloroplasts when we talk about photosynthesis, which is its own chapter later on. But in plants, chloroplasts carry out photosynthesis. You can also see them, we'll look at some cells in a second where you'll see them, they're bright green because they have chlorophyll in them. Oh, and they're only in plants, by the way. In animals and plants, you have mitochondria. Mitochondria are number 1. They look kind of like monster mouths with they have these little folds in them that kind of look like angry little teeth. And they make cellular energy. Cellular energy is called ATP. So they're very important in powering cells. So cells that use a lot of energy will have a lot of mitochondria. In plants only, you have a large central vacuole, which is number 4. For the most part, it stores water and helps maintain the cell shape because it fills up the space here. If the plant goes through a drought, or it's an indoor plant and you don't water it for a long time, it becomes floppy, right? And that happens because the vacuoles of each individual cell uses up the water, and that water goes away, and it causes the plant to droop and wilt.
I took left hand from her.
So this is a actual plant cell, and the part in the middle here, and I do hope you can see my cursor, is the central vacuole that's full of water for the most part. This is the nucleus, and this is a bunch of chloroplasts over here. All right, so in an animal cell, let's go ahead and label that. We'll start here. Number 10 is a Golgi apparatus, and there are a bunch of them scattered around the cell. 5 is the cell membrane. 6 is a vacuole. 3 is pointing to the little dots, which are ribosomes. 8 is pointing to the nucleus. But if it was pointing to these squiggly lines, why don't we make a little line to point to these squiggly lines? Then it's pointing to the DNA or the chromatin. 11 is pointing to the nuclear membrane or the nucleus. 4 is pointing to the rough endoplasmic reticulum here, the rough ER. 7 is pointing to the cytoplasm. 1 is pointing to a vesicle. This is probably it's probably a lysosome or a peroxisome. Those are the ones that you talked about in your reading. Lysosomes have digestive enzymes, and peroxisomes have detoxify. So sort of antitoxins, if you will. Number 2 is pointing to the mitochondria. This is the smooth ER up here, so I'm not sure why it doesn't have a number, but you should label it up at the very top. All right, nucleolus, these are going over them again. We're not going to go over them in plant and animal cells, but let's talk about the cytoskeleton. There are different parts of the cytoskeleton. There are microfilaments, microtubules, and centrioles. Microfilaments are a little bit smaller than microtubules, and centrioles are organelles that if you go back to, I don't know why we didn't label them. Hold on, let's go back. Oh, number 14 is centrioles. I don't think I even said it. 14 is centrioles. And those centrioles are involved in helping the cell divide. So the cytoskeleton is microfilaments, microtubules. Microfilaments help cells move. Microtubules hold up organelles. And centrioles help the cell divide. And you have a cytoskeleton only in animal cells. Part of the cytoskeleton involves flagella. Flagella are microtubules that help cells have whip-like tails that move around. Back in that kingdom that we didn't ever talk about, that I was like, oh, it's not even here. Those protists, there are individual cells that are flagellates that move around with flagella. In humans, the sperm are the only cells that have flagella. Cilia, this is a look down on cilia. You have it in your lungs and in your nose, and they help protect you from particles that you inhale. They're made of microtubules, and they beat together, so they have their own movement. In single-celled organisms, this can help cells swim, but in your body, it can help move particles, particularly those associated with mucus. If you inhale some dust, it will stick to the mucus and the cilia will push it away from your lungs and towards your nose and mouth where you can cough it out or spit it out. Gross, huh? And finally, we have centrioles, and the centrioles, when the cell divides and makes two cells, which is something we'll talk about later, when that happens, the centrioles are what make that happen. All right, so that's the end of the lecture. I'm going to make another video that describes the homework, but this is separate from that.